Seawater comes straight out of the pristine ocean where it's pumped into a series of lakes. The Marlborough sun and hot, dry nor'west winds slowly evaporate the water until a year later when it ends up as pure brine, 10 times more concentrated than the sea. The salt drops to form a deep crystalline bed and then the ponds are drained.
And we end up with the salt crust as we're standing on here.
Yeah, great big lumps of it. What can go wrong?
Weather is our biggest enemy, of course. We like plenty of sunshine, hot, dry nor'west winds, and no rainfall. Otherwise, we'll get our salt dissolved away.
Lake Grassmere is located 33 kilometres south of Blenheim. Māori knew this lake as ka parataho, which means ruffled waters, a reference to the persistent northwesterly winds that prevail here. These warm winds, combined with the low annual rainfall, lots of sunshine and proximity to the sea and transport routes, make Lake Grassmere an ideal place for salt evaporation. In pre-European times, Māori got most of their salt requirements from eating fish and seafood, so their settlements tended to be coastal. After Europeans arrived, attempts to commercially produce salt were unsuccessful. However, in 1942, the industrialist George Skellerup had the idea to establish a salt works at Lake Grassmere. Skellerup was a rubber manufacturer, and his business needed salt to make the caustic soda required to recycle old rubber. Skellerup had plans drawn up for 20 concentration ponds at Lake Grassmere, but wartime shortages and the worst winter floods in 30 years delayed construction. In 1947, the government brought a share of the operation and the company changed its name from Skellerup Solar Salt Limited to Dominion Salt Limited. After years of setbacks, 45 tonnes worth of salt was collected by shovel and washed with brine in a concrete mixer. Early methods at Lake Grassmere were based on those of overseas salt works, but other works were closer to the equator and relied mainly on the heat of the sun to evaporate salt water. Salt makers at Grassmere soon found that it was wind rather than the sun that did most of the work. Scientists then worked out a process of moving the brines, or salty water, from pond to pond as their concentration of salt increased. This special system, tailored to Marlborough's unique evaporating conditions, increased the harvest year by year. In 1962, new crystallisation ponds were built, and the rest of the lake was used as a large initial evaporation pond by pumping seawater into it. Conveyor belts replaced the light rail system used at harvest time, and production rose to 28,000 tonnes of salt in 1965. By 1970, the salt harvest had increased to almost 52,000 tonnes, but this could not match demand, which had increased due to the growth of various industries. Lake Grassmere could not supply all the country's salt needs, so salt was imported from the Caribbean and Australia. Today, the salt-making operation at Lake Grassmere covers an area of 17 square kilometres and produces 60 to 70,000 tonnes of salt each year, about half the country's needs. Seawater, which contains just under 3% salt, is pumped into Lake Grassmere. Wind and sun evaporate the water, leaving behind a progressively saltier solution. When the salt content in the lake has increased to 5%, the brine is transferred to a series of large concentration ponds. When the brine has increased to 25% salt, it is pumped into deep holding ponds, where it is held over winter. In October, the 6-monthly salt-making process begins. The saturated solution is pumped from the deep holding ponds into smaller crystallisation ponds. The salt forms crystals on the bottom of these ponds. In March, when the salt is ready for harvest, the remaining brine containing other minerals is pumped from the crystallisation ponds into the sea. After the crystallisation ponds are drained, mechanical harvesters work around the clock for about 5 weeks, scooping up the crystallised salt crust, or cake. The salt is then loaded onto trucks and taken to be washed in brine. After it has been crushed and sieved to produce similar-sized grains, it is sent to users.